My name is Nathan Albert. Welcome to the second part of the conventional row crop farming webinar that we are hosting here. I'm very glad that you've joined us. We already did the first part on Tuesday, and that was about conventional row crop practices in the field. Today will be the second part. The intent of the series is to help landowners like you better understand the conventional row crop farming system, so you can speak with your tenant farmer as you want to change practices or adjust practices and really understand where they're coming from. Farming, as you may know, uses up about 60% of the farmland area of Illinois. I'm sorry, 75%. And of that 75%, farmland owners who don't farm the land themselves represent about 60% of that. So farmland owners are actually a very big part of our agricultural system. And so you have the potential, people who are attending this, farmland owners, you have the potential to impact the agricultural system by the practices that you have on your own land. So again, we're very grateful to have this possible. We are joined on this call by public landowners, private landowners, nonprofit advocates, nonprofit land trusts. Between all of you, you directly steward over almost 15,000 acres of farmland in Illinois, and indirectly through your actions and your words and your values, you have the chance to impact thousands more. So I'm very grateful that all of you are here today. We're very fortunate to have Rob Woodrow and Kent Kraft here again with us from Farmland Solutions. I'll introduce them again just a little bit. Before we do that, I want to just dive in and just share again some information that we shared in the last session as well. So I'm with the Liberty Prairie Foundation. We're a nonprofit with a 94-acre organic farm in Prairie Crossing in Grays Lake, Illinois. We use that farm to promote, sustain, and demonstrate sustainable farming. The program that is sort of I'm managing that's making this event happen is the Northeast Illinois Farmland program. It's a land access program. And our purpose is to bring together landowners and farmers, help them find each other, and work out good arrangements together. You can find our program at illinoisfarmlink.org. You can also find our General Liberty Prairie Foundation website at libertyprairie.org. I want to give special thanks to our funding partner, Food Land Opportunity Flow, localizing the Chicago Food Shed. It's a collaborative initiative of the Chicago Community Trust and the Kinship Foundation. Their goal is to create a resilient local food economy that protects and conserves natural areas and other resources. Super grateful to them for their generosity to us and to many other groups throughout the Chicago region. Also want to give a special shout out to the McHenry County Conservation District. They've been our thought partner in figuring out the content of this series. We've also been very happy and fortunate to be able to sort of assist them as they develop a really pioneering farmland management system for their 6,000 acres of farmland. So I want to just give a shout out to them. We are recording the session and links will be available for it as soon as I can make that available. I'm not the most technically savvy guy in the room. We are going to allow questions. Please use the chat function at the bottom of your Zoom screen to send in questions. I'll moderate those. Kent and Rob have been very generous in offering to take your questions by email or call after this session and sort of give you advice. So we're super grateful to them for doing that. I'd like to reintroduce Rob and Kent. As I mentioned last time, they both grew up in farms, Kent in Iowa, Rob in Illinois. Kent had a 10-year farming career before moving to farm management. Rob was with the USDA in a variety of capacities. Between them, they have 53 years of farm management experience, and they currently manage 177 farms, 60,000 acres in Illinois, Iowa, Minnesota, Wisconsin, and South Dakota. And I'm also very pleased to say that they're one of the first independent farm management companies to get into the organic farm management business. and they have currently 4,100 acres either certified already or in transition. I think they're especially appropriate for talking about farming and commercial row crop farming because they are used to communicating with both farmers and farm landowners about all aspects of farming. They know all the details. They know how all the pieces of the system fit together. And I think that makes them especially valuable. I thought they did a great job on Tuesday. So I'm looking forward to that. As I mentioned before, on Tuesday, they dived into the practices and inputs and decisions that farmers need to sort of work through as they work in the field over the course of a year. Today, they're going to take us kind of behind the curtain at some of the things that we normally don't see in terms of the finance, the business, the government program impacts, leases, all those kind of things that frankly shape the kind of farming that's done. We can't really understand what a farmer is doing unless we understand the total picture that includes government programs, commodity markets, and everything else. So I think they're going to be especially valuable today. Rob and Kent, towards the end of their presentation, will also be just diving in briefly into some insights and advice for you as you talk with your tenant farmer about adjustments or better practices. And I think many of the landowners that I've talked to who are on this call have sometimes had some challenges around that area. So I'm hoping Rob and Kent will give us some good advice in that area. Rob and Kent, again, we're so grateful that you are giving this information and doing it so concisely and well, and please take it away.
Okay, well, good morning. It's gratifying to see that we have an audience. We didn't scare or bore everyone else off from our Tuesday presentation. So I'm going to go ahead and do the transition here. Let me
down at the bottom. So share. There you
go. Okay, and then if I do this. Okay, do I have my first slide up?
Yep, it's working.
Okay, good. So here we are on Thursday. You might notice if you watched us on Tuesday, we've got a different background. We are in our office in Sherman. Apologize, our internet signal is a little bit slower here than it was at my house in Springfield, but hopefully it won't be too laggy. What I thought we would do today is start with maybe a little intellectual exercise. I know Nathan mentioned something about agriculture being a business on Tuesday. And if you were going to get into any kind of business, you might do what's called a SWOT analysis, strategic planning, look at your strengths, your weaknesses, your opportunities, and your threats. We're going to get into finance. That will include farm budgets and some of the cost of doing business as a farmer. Risk management is a big tool for any business, especially for agriculture. Leasing is a big topic. There's a lot of different ways to lease land. USDA farm programs, there were a few years when they were not as important as they've been in the past, but they become increasingly important in this environment that we're in. We're going to wrap it up with kind of a discussion of farm management and talk about farmers. So getting into the strategic analysis, and this has to do with looking at the overall structure of your industry. And some of this we've talked about on Tuesday. What do we have going for us in agriculture? We've got this wonderful infrastructure already built for growing corn and soybeans and getting it to market. We've got plenty of capital available. We've got the crop productivity with our soils and weather. We've got the technology that keeps changing. It keeps improving, or changing at least. Some people don't think of it as improving, but it's changing anyway. We've got a lot of support from our government, and farmers in general have a good support from the rest of society. And we have seen maybe a increasing ability to adapt to changing conditions. You may not be familiar with the economic term of inelasticity. It has to do with the idea that everybody's stomach is about the same size. They eat about the same amount of food every day when it's available. So it doesn't matter what the supply is, the demand is always going to be there. In terms of weaknesses, we've been our biggest or we're the victim of our biggest success, I guess is the way to put it. We generally produce more than enough food. It all has to get eaten. That results in low prices, and some of the excess production is due to our inability to control the weather. Some of the weaknesses we're fighting, and we seem to have new pests every year or every other year. Farmers, they've had a tremendous increase in their wealth from 2012 to 2015. Since then, they've been either stable or losing a little bit financially. Soil degradation, we addressed that a little bit on Tuesday. Switching to opportunities, new markets. They're talking about this next topic also, new crops. We thought hemp was going to be a big deal. It was big, but it was not the best deal. Niche markets, again, hemp, yellow peas, another niche market that might be coming up. Renewable fuels, electricity and solar is an opportunity for landowners to generate income if the income from the grain is down. This desire for sustainability, and that's a societal desire. People want to know that their food is produced in a manner that's not going to be bad for the environment. And it's related to the farm to table. People want to know where their food is coming from. Moving over to threats, you might wonder why electric vehicles would be a threat to agriculture. I need to think about burning gasoline with 10% alcohol in it, generated from corn. That's already come back to bite us with a decreased miles driven during the COVID crisis. The demand for gasoline just crashed. That also meant the demand for ethanol crashed. So we've got a lot of ethanol plants shutting down. They're not buying corn, and that's why corn went from close to $4 down to less than $3 in some places. Plant-based meat substitute, you might wonder about that also. I read an article a couple months ago that was an eye-opener for me. I wasn't sure how this stuff is manufactured. From what I read, it is basically coming out of like a fermentation vat. You still have some agricultural products get dumped in, but not near as much as you do in animal agriculture. And the gist of the article was that if we switched entirely to plant-based meat substitutes, we could do away with quite a bit of the agriculture that we have in the Midwest. And I'm hoping that theory was a little bit far-fetched, but you never know. This is a topic we talked about a little bit on Tuesday. We were saying weeds and insects develop some resistance to the chemicals that we have. The anti-technology forces, you might consider yourself as part of that. Rob and I are to some extent. We got an announcement today that dicamba has run into a legal snag. As far as we can tell right now, dicamba is going to be illegal for this year unless a higher court rules against the Ninth Circuit. Invasive plants. Seems like a lot of bad things come from Asia, unfortunately. The Asian soybean rust and some of the other insects. Trade wars, we thought last year was bad. This year doesn't seem to be much better. And something I didn't give too much of a thought before is the pandemic that we're dealing with now and all the impact it's having on us. So I'm going to switch over to let Rob take this next topic.
Well, some of the financial aspects of agriculture, the capital, it is obviously a capital intensive business. The land, who owns it? Non-farmers own 60% of it in Illinois. Widows and children of farmers are a lot of those people. Some are trust and investors. Farmers own some. Obviously, unless it's for lack of a better word, old money farm. Most of it is, most farmers rent a good percentage of the land. One of the myths that everybody here talks about is the myth of corporate farms. The vast majority of farms in the Midwest, Illinois, are still family operations. Now, they may be a big operation and they may operate under a corporate entity, but generally they're still a family operation. The ADMs, Cargills, those type of companies do not operate farms. The corporate farms are a little bit more into livestock, control the hog, chicken, and cattle to some extent, but to say that there are large corporations out there operating the farms, that's just not the case in Illinois. I mean, you have landowners, that investors that may be large entities, but typically farmers themselves are not a large corporate entity.
If I could jump in, Rob, we're talking 98% of the acres are operated as family farms. And even when a corporate entity does own land, it's very likely that they are leasing that land to a family farmer.
Mm-hmm. Sources of operating money for the actual farmers, those are the banks, local banks, regional banks, and even some of the national banks. National banks typically don't want to deal with agriculture for some reason. They think it's high risk, but usually one of the ones that pay the bills first. Farm credit system, which was created back in the 30s, is a co-op system similar to the grain elevator system we talked about, and the finance separately from the Fed and such. And insurance companies like Metropolitan Life, Prudential, and other large insurance companies provide financing for the land purchases and such, because they need to keep their life insurance money invested so and earning a safe return. They look at loaning money on farmland as a pretty safe bet.
Okay, Rob and I both have degrees in agricultural economics, and there's a reason they call it the dismal science. So we get excited about this kind of stuff. Most people, normal people don't. But we do need to talk about some numbers. You might set your alarm clock for 10 minutes from now if you are not into statistics and accounting and that type of thing. But we're going to talk about income and expenses. In grain marketing, income is price times yield times the ownership share. And you might wonder what the ownership share means. That has to do with leasing, and we'll get into that more in detail. The expenses, we're talking about your seed, fertilizer, pest control. That is going to vary. We refer to those as variable expenses. They vary with the amount of crops that you have. You have other costs that do not vary. Even if you have zero crops, you're still going to have to pay for your machinery. The land has a cost associated with it, either just the taxes if you own it. You might have a mortgage payment on it. You might be renting it. You can't farm without putting in some labor and some management expense, and then we'll have to have insurance. So it's not a difficult concept. Income minus expenses equals net income. And again, I feel like I need to apologize if I'm insulting your intelligence here, but just as an example, how we calculate cost per acre. You take a bag of seed corn that might cost $350, and there's usually 80,000 kernels in that bag. You're going to plant 34,000 per acre, and these are just average numbers. So that brings the cost per acre of that one bag, since that bag covers about 2.3 some acres, it's $148.94 per acre. Now, the thing to keep in mind there, that is a cost per acre, and it is not related to how many bushels you're producing. So at 200 bushels per acre, you just divide that $148 by 200 and come up with the 74 cents per bushel is how much your seed costs you for what you're producing. But if that same acre only produces 100 bushels per acre, your seed cost has effectively doubled because you're dividing the cost over half as many.
And when you consider corn is selling for roughly $3 a bushel right now, you see that eats into the cost pretty significantly. Fertilizers the same way. You've got several choices of nitrogen. We talked about those last Tuesday. You got anhydrous, you got liquid nitrogen, 28%, there's dry urea, phosphate, several variations of that, potassium, sulfur, micronutrients. Each form has a specific price, and you use it as an amount based on soil tests, and then technology is allowing us to use variable rates. So what we do, grid sample the farm, the soil areas of the farm. We can put less fertility on the higher fertility areas of the farm and build up the lower fertility to even out the farms. It doesn't work 100% exactly like that, but the technology allows us to not spend as much on the poorer producing areas of the farm if it's not going to provide a return.
And the wonderful thing about the computer programs that calculate this is that you will give the soil test to the fertilizer company and they can run it through their computer system, even though the rate is going to vary of the different ingredients as you go to the different areas of the field. You'll still end up with the number of pounds of each product that they're going to put on that field, because they take a computer chip to plug into the machine in the field, and it follows that direction as the machine travels across the field. This is just a small portion of a spreadsheet that we use when we're calculating costs for our grain producers. And I'm not going to take this line by line. I just want to give you a brief glimpse of what the complexities can be. Here's a simplified version, and I use numbers from the University of Illinois farm business, farm management folks for Northern Illinois. The crop income was, I know for example, corn, they were using 212 bushels per acre times $3.30, as I recall. And this is the university cost for the seed, fertilizer, pesticides, and miscellaneous. There'd be some, you could break this further into categories, but this is a simplified version for corn and beans. So looking at the income minus the variable expenses, you're looking at a gross profit there, $355 per acre, and coming out exactly the same for corn or soybeans, which would be highly unusual, but that's the way the numbers shook out with what I used. Now this is just the top half of a page. We're going to look at the bottom page because this does not include our fixed expenses. And you look at what happened to that little yellow piggy bank. He's upside down now. We take that gross operating net of $355 an acre. We're subtracting the machinery, labor, and insurance, and the land cost. And here I plugged in a modest $250 an acre cash rent. And our total expenses, the variable and fixed, come to 419, exceeding our income by the $64 an acre for corn and 47 for beans. So we're looking at a net loss for corn or beans. So more for corn.
And when you look at that and you go, okay, how does negative income budgeting work? How does that work for a farmer? Well, obviously the farmer is borrowing money and they hope to pay it back in the current year, the next year. But, it's a budget, but, where we used 375 for corn and probably 8.5 for beans, something that way. Keep in mind, those markets change daily. So that can drastically change from budget time to harvest and thereafter you store the grain. So it's a hope and pray system an awful lot, but that's how they can justify a negative income budget. And then farm program subsidies, those are not set. They have a parameter. It's based off of yields and prices on a county level, so that those subsidies can vary by county. If they have a good actual production history, crop insurance may pay them based on if they use a revenue protection program, that if yields go up and prices go down, their policy may guarantee them so many dollars of revenue. Even though they may have bumper yields, prices be down, they still may get a crop insurance a payment. Other disaster assistance that may come along from the federal government for trade war compensation in 2019, the market facilitation program paid like $65 an acre. That was a non-budget item that we didn't know what was going to happen, and it was unexpected. that's what kept a lot of guys in business after 2019. In 2020, we've got the CARES program, the coronavirus compensation, PPP program, fair amount of money flowing in to, again, help offset losses in crop income and livestock prices in the year. 2020, we're going to see ample money flowing through from the government. Just be honest, it's an election year. Everybody's going to want to make sure money's flowing. When I worked for USDA, I don't remember exactly which president it was, but there was a supplemental payment that came out, and we were instructed that that check would arrive in the mailbox 2 days before the election. So don't think politics doesn't play into the federal farm program if it can. So they do play that game in Washington, D.C.
That's a reason for that question mark after 2021. With a non-election year, we don't know if the tap may be tightened down at least.
Robin Kent,
Yes.
I have one question. The question is, does the pricing on seed and inputs track with commodity prices, or does input pricing tend to stay stable?
What we've seen in the past is there's a lag. The corporations that provide the seed and the chemicals, they have their pricing set. They don't, I guess they're a little reluctant to cut prices any sooner than they have to, but they have to face reality at some point. The fertilizer has to be very sensitive to it. Farmers can either cut back, or even for, in the case of phosphate and potash, they can cut it out completely for a year with the idea that they will build up a deficit in future years. Nitrogen has to go on, but the other inputs, there just will be increased competition. If you see the opportunity where farmers are really going to do more shopping than they would otherwise.
In the years 2011 through 2015, when farm income was really high, the inputs were probably increasing faster than the income rate. They're not coming down as fast, which is eating into the farmers' working capital, and land rents are the same way. We take some of that's always a year behind what's going on in the actual world, but before we make adjustments, because rent's set in the fall before we even know what crops are going to be planted and such, and that's just we'll get into that more in a little bit, but that's just some of those things just lag a year or two behind.
Okay, very good, thank you.
Okay, I picked this slide to start our discussion of risk management. A lot of people would think farmers don't have much risk difference than the people in that car, if there are any. But that's really not the case. We've got a lot of tools available in agriculture to minimize the risk. And in terms of what risk we're talking about, income is the biggest one, price times yield. The price varies every day. You don't know what the yield is until you get it in the combine. If you're storing it in the farm, you still have some risk of storage loss. Weather, that's a risk. Pollution, there I'm thinking about the semi truck where the driver fell asleep last year or last winter, went into the ditch, landed on a farm I manage upside down. He was hauling, fortunately, a very dilute form of liquid fertilizer that not much of it spilled, and what did probably was a benefit to this year's crop, not a detriment, but we still don't know. Defaults, that has to do with cash rent when your farmer his check bounces. And we have a legal system in this country, plenty of lawyers. The legal system in this country is really bad, but even so, it's still the best in the world probably. But the risk is that you could still be brought into court by anybody for any reason. Didn't happen to me personally, but another farm manager I worked with was sued. A deer farmer fell out of the tree and broke a leg or something. He was suing the farm manager for not keeping him out of that farm. So that's the kind of thing you can run into. The things we use to manage that risk, for the income, you can price you can contract your price when it's a favorable price. You can do that a year ahead of time, a couple of years ahead of time if you want to keep rolling contracts. There's a number of different contracts. We could spend a whole day talking about the different forms of way to protect yourself on price. Insurance, everybody has to have some liability insurance for sure, even if it's bare ground. If you've got buildings, you want to insure them. We have a federal crop insurance program that really works well now. You're not just insuring yield, you can insure revenue. So this year, we've got these negative budgets if you're just looking at the crop income, but we do have some crop insurance that if we don't improve the price, that we will kick that in on top of the farm program payments. Wind and hail is a separate policy that is sold. We generally purchase it on about every farm where we're involved in the crop. That also will cover fire, which hopefully or fortunately is not a big occurrence, but it can happen. Farm program helps provide some insurance for its additional income when the prices are low or the yield. Written agreements will protect you. I'm mostly thinking of your lease for the farm there. The certificates of insurance, anytime you have a vendor, if you're hiring people to do work on the farm, you need to make sure that they have liability insurance.
We're going to switch over to land leasing now, and the biggest question is always what is fair. The income, the rent is derived from the income generated. So is it half to each, percentage of the income, risk versus reward, return on investment dollars? The quality of the land drives the income generated, and also the amount of rent that the landowner may get. Leases are adaptable. There's many ways of leasing farms. Length of lease. Kent and I prefer a year-to-year lease. Manage many farms that are on the third generation of tenants and have been on one-year leases, but we don't like to see anything longer than a 3-year lease because things do go wrong, and when they go wrong, we need to be able to make changes, and a longer-term lease makes that difficult. So we prefer year-to-year leases, so if something's wrong, we can make changes.
Okay, this is an approach that I like to use when I'm explaining to a farmer why I'm going to charge what I'm going to charge him. Yeah, jump backwards there for a second. This is what an example I use. If you had $10,000, you could buy 2 different things. You could buy 1 acre of pretty good Central Illinois farm ground, or you could take that same $10,000 and buy a corporate or maybe a U.S. Treasury bond and look at your return on investment. And the investment, if the risk and reward ratio is similar, the return on investment you would expect to be similar. You can't get 2.5%, I don't think, anymore on a low risk bond, but it was a few months ago that you could. So your $10,000 would earn you $250 in net income. So my argument is that the return on that $10,000 worth of farmland should be similar. Take a $290 an acre rent, subtract off your $40 of property taxes, you end up with that same $250. So to me, that was a good economic justification for the rent level.
There's many types of land leases. The cash rent, variable cash rent, crop share, hybrid cash, crop share lease, and custom farming contract is just a few of what we currently use. The cash rent lease is based on the tillable acres. Sometimes if there's a set of buildings on the property, we'll add an additional building rent or other leaseholder rights. The rent amount is based on soil productivity and yields, competition for the land, and to some extent the negotiating skill of either the landowner and or the farmer. On soil productivity, the lower productivity soils, where there's drainage issues, just poorer quality soils, we like to see cash rent in the 30 to 33% of the expected gross revenue. On a medium quality farm, we're going to probably be in the 33 to 35% of gross revenue. And on a high productive, high quality farm, we're going to be 35 to 38% of the gross revenue, expected gross revenue each year. And that goes back to the equation we did earlier of expected yield times expected price to get the gross revenue and to come up with an expected gross revenue. Many ways to calculate it. That's just one of the ways we do it. Obviously, if there's more farmers looking for land, they're going to bid higher than that in areas of poor quality land where they're may have trouble finding a tenant. I mean, I have dealt with farms where there's not a big tenant pool, and it becomes difficult, if it's especially a large tract, to find a tenant, and they have the upper hand. Versus here in Central Illinois, I can pick up a phone and rent a farm in 5 minutes, and in South Dakota it may take me 3 weeks. So, timing of cash rent. Traditionally, March 1st and November 1st is when cash rent payments are made. Usually half up front and the other half November 1st. Payments of 100% March 1 eliminates the risk of default. So far, we don't have a lot of defaults in Illinois, but there has been some. Illinois law does provide the landlord statutory lien, but that lien has to be perfected before harvest. So if you're concerned about receiving that second half of rent, you need to do that before the grain's harvested and delivered to an elevator. Irrevocable letter of credit, which is a bank guarantee of payment, is the best way to guarantee that second installment of cash rent. And some people actually use it for the first installment of cash rent if they question whether the tenant will make that payment or not. March 1, if the payment doesn't come, I mean, mechanisms can move into place that you can terminate that lease and get a new tenant before planting season. But November 1 rent doesn't come and the crop's harvested, and you don't have your second installment rent doesn't come. You didn't perfect that landlord's lien, you could be SOL pretty easily.
Just a quick note on that irrevocable letter of credit. The banks do charge the farmers to produce those letters. They are considered the same as a loan in terms of the bank's accounting of their status. And I haven't checked lately what they're charging, but it does amount to several dollars per acre.
Generally, 1% of the value is a good rule of thumb. So you have to take that into account. It's fair to take that into account when you're negotiating a rent, that if you want an irrevocable letter of credit, there is some cost to the farmer for that. So you have to think about those things.
Here's a simplified cash rent budget from the viewpoint of the landowner. Just picked $275 an acre as a fairly modest cash rent for say average or medium quality land. The landowner under a cash rent lease is paying the property taxes. The liability insurance is probably pennies rather than a dollar. If you're talking any sizable land at all, we can purchase a policy for $5 million of liability coverage for 80 acres for a little over $100. I plugged in some management expense. If you have a professional farm manager, it might be more than that or less than that. But leaving you with that as a net income for the cash rent budget for the landowner. Variable cash rent is something that was fairly new, maybe 10 years ago?
So we've been doing it about 15 years.
It is something that the farmers like because the cash rent will vary depending on conditions of that year, the year that they've signed the lease for. If prices go down, they're not going to be faced with a real high rent If the prices go up, the landowner gets to share in that prosperity with the increased bonus rent. It's fairly simple in concept. If the net income's higher, the rent is higher, but putting it into words is a lot more difficult. We sign the leases at one time during the year, and so by the time it comes the time to sign the lease for the next year, I really have to study those words again to make sure I can explain them when I get the questions. You can base it on various factors. You can use the actual farm yield or go to a county average as terms of your yield component. The prices, you can use a day or a set of a number of days or just the average over a certain period of time. But that would get spelled out in the lease. And the farmers, once they get used to the concept, are pretty accepting of it. The key is to have the base rent, which is the minimum that they're going to pay at a reasonable level. And we've probably converted 90% of our cash rent leases to this form, where the rent can vary.
I would say that the reasonable level would be 15% below, 15 to 20% below what the flat cash rent would be for a farm. So that, which gives the farmers a little breathing room if it's a bad year, and you get to participate if it's a good year, either yield and or price wise. So it's we have, like Kent said, we have on about 90% of our cash rent clients are that. Some of the leases we pick 3 days out of a year that we average that price. I have other leases that I use the close of Chicago Board of Trade every Thursday for a period of December 1st through the end of October. Average that minus a basis, which would be the for the farm, which is the difference between the basis is the difference between the futures price of the Chicago Board of Trade and what the cash price would be at the region of the farm. So to there again, trying to boil it down to what's a fair amount for those for each individual farm, because the Chicago Board of Trade gives us a benchmark, but each farm has transportation costs, so that's what a lot of the basis is. Other crop share leases, the old 50-50 crop share lease is used to be the most common lease in Illinois, where the landowner and tenant each paid half the crop expenses. The landowner paid, and the tenant each got half the crop. The landowner would pay their own insurance and land taxes, and then the farm tenant would provide the machinery and labor. The reduced tillage and higher use of herbicides now has skewed that more towards the farmer. Which is one of the things that pushed many of the crop share leases to cash rent, because the farmers just weren't spending the time and the labor on a particular farm. They'd come in, farm it, do some tillage if they tilled it, no-tilled it, and planted it, had it sprayed, and they didn't come back till harvest time and harvested it. So that really got to a lot of landowners switching more to cash rent. I still like the 50-50 crop share lease for the organic farms, because it shows the tenant that the landowner is serious about it. They're willing to put skin in the game and share the risk and the reward. And crop insurance does help offset that for both of them. Percentages can be adjusted where the tenant pays more expense than the landowner, or the landowner gets a larger percentage of the crop. It's unusual to be other than 50-50. Sometimes it's 40-60. I do have some clients where we use what I call a modified crop share lease, where the landowner gets a percentage of the crop, but the tenant pays all the inputs, except for the landowner's crop insurance, taxes, and drying expenses, and sometimes transportation costs of the crop if it's going beyond the local elevator. Another hybrid lease is a combination of cash and crop share, where the landowner and the tenant are still 50-50 crop share on all the income expenses and the production risk, but the landowner receives a small cash rent payment in addition to a share of the crop. And that's usually $15 to $25 an acre. that kind of helps offset the increase in real estate taxes that we're seeing on the farmland and such. So custom farming is something that I like to say are well-to-do landowners use some of. The landowner pays the farmer by the acre or by the hour. We use a schedule. We prepare a schedule and a lease and an operating agreement. The landowner becomes the producer. They get 100% of the crop. They pay 100% of the input expenses. It is higher risk, but along with higher risk, generally produces a higher income return on investment. It's not common, but it is being done more with the affluent landowners who are willing to take the risk.
You might wonder how you come up with a lease. I do have a client now that previously was paying her attorney to write the lease, get it updated every year. That's a doable plan. It's going to be expensive. The University of Illinois has a one-size-fits-most lease form online. You can download it and fill in the blanks. It used to be back when we could shake hands safely. We have not as a professional farm manager, a lot of people had a handshake lease and it was mostly the 50-50, or they might even agree on a dollar amount for cash rent lease. That's not recommended because you might remember what you agreed to. The farmer might remember what he agreed to, and it might be two different memories. If your farmer passes away, then who can prove what is in effect? That's a high risk operation to not have it written down. Do it yourself is not recommended. There's a lot of things you might not think of that should be included in a lease. We had our form when we formed this company to get an attorney to review it. So it's a one-size-fits-all that we use. Once you get the lease signed, you've entered into a legal contract and you're bound by the terms in that lease. If you want to make some changes, it requires agreement on both parties, which can be done if it's reasonable, if the tenant agrees. And he may even agree to some things that he may not think are reasonable if he thinks it's going to keep him on that farm for longer term. If it's legal, you can put it in the contract. If you want some special terms for the conservation practices on your farm, you can put that in the lease. It'd be probably the best way to make sure that they happen. The problem becomes if the weather conditions or soil conditions are such that the farmer does not have that ability, that he's not unfairly penalized for things that are not within his control. But yeah, you can control what kind of crops you're going to grow, what rotations they're going to follow. You can require the tenant to mow it, or you can preclude him from mowing it if you want to make sure the birds have a nesting environment. You can include hunting in the lease, or you can specifically exclude it so you can rent it to someone else. You might have buildings that the landowner wants to use that the tenant is precluded from using, or you might just say that's included. So it's just a matter of discussion, communication, make sure it's done in writing. If the tenant is in violation of the lease, it doesn't immediately void it. Generally, you'd have 2 weeks for the tenant to correct his lease violation. And at that point, the lease may be voidable, or there may be some penalties that come into play.
Sometimes you do have to remind the tenants who owns the land. They may not agree with some of the cover crops or conservation requirements, rotations and such, but you have to remind them that this is my farm and this is what I want. If you don't want to do it, somebody else will. But a lot of times it doesn't come to that. They usually get the message. Conservation, yes.
Okay, I have 2 questions here.
Yeah.
One is, someone asks, do you find that variable cash rent is an incentive for the farmer to integrate conservation practices? Does that question make sense?
It can be. I mean, that is by giving a lower rent, up front. You can include those conservation practices you want, such as cover crops and such. And if it works out fine, you're going to get the landowner's going to benefit from it. The tenant's going to benefit from it. But that could be the incentive used to get those practices put in place. There again, that becomes part of the negotiating skills.
An example I can think of is if you're trying to encourage a tenant to go to no-till farming and he doesn't have any experience, he might have some hesitation on a cash rent farm. But if you've got a base rent that, if he thinks his yields are going to suffer because he's not doing tillage, he might be more willing to try it if he knows that the yield that he gets will determine the cash rent.
Another example would be if you want cover crops on your farm, part of the lease, what you might do in the lease terms is say, okay, I want cover crops. I will pay for the seed, you plant it. So they don't perceive that they have a huge initial expense in the cover crop that they may not get a reward out of. So that there again, that's a variable lease that you could put that term into.
The other question is, do you have a different philosophy on lease duration for organic farmland versus conventional? The usual thing I've heard is that the organic farmer is building the soil and he's going to be more comfortable with making that investment in organic certification and so on if he knows he's going to have that land for some time to enjoy the benefits of.
Yeah, that's an excellent question, because you've got the 3-year transition, or 36 month, generally 2 crops, where you're going through the transition, where you're changing your practices. You
Right.
probably running into some production issues you haven't had before, and you're not getting the premium for certified organic production.
I tell you how I approach that. Because that question has been posed to me more than once, is I generally don't like to change tenants every year. I don't want to change tenants every year. But if there's a train wreck happening, you got to be able to fix the tracks and keep things going. If it's your farm, you want to farm organically, and for some reason the farm tenant isn't getting it done, doesn't want to do it, and there's a train wreck happening, you have to be able to get out of that lease. I think at one of the conferences that Nathan and I were at, that question was asked to me, and I'd had a question emailed to me by somebody, and they wanted a farm transition, and the farmer wanted an 8-year lease. And it's great for the tenant because he knows he's going to have the farm for 8 years, and then it required a 4-year notification of a termination. So he's kind of got a 12-year lease now. But I just can't imagine a nightmare for the landowner if things aren't going well, for weed control, whatever, and you're stuck with that tenant. So to me, I like the 1-year lease. No more than 3 years, and if the farmer doesn't trust you to retain him, you might need to find a different farmer, because all roughly 4,000 acres that we work with, it's either in transition or certified organic, is on a 1-year lease.
Okay, very good.
So,
thank you.
Yeah, we have this on all types of farms, and my typical response is, hey, you do your job, you're going to get the farm next year. It's changing tenants is not fun.
Okay, very good. Thank you, guys.
mm-hmm. Conservation acres, and that's also a part of the terms of the lease. So if you got a riparian area that's in CRP, and how long is that CRP contract, and what services are required? Generally, what we do for a landowner, where it's cash rent, crop share, whatever, even a custom, the landowner gets 100% of the conservation payments, and then we will turn around and reimburse the tenant if they mow the acres for us, or provides a seating service or whatever. That way, if again, if there's a lease change, there's no carryover for a previous tenant. That's not a situation we want, and so we just let the landowner get the payment. There are a few instances where we have because of payment limitation or payment eligibility rules with the federal programs, that the tenants actually get the payment and then reimburse the landowner most or all that payment. But those are in situations generally where it's been a long-term relationship with the tenant and there's a comfortable relationship that we don't expect anything to go wrong. So.
Okay, a lease termination, we've been talking about a little bit already. Every lease needs to have a termination clause. If you don't have a written lease with a termination clause, the state law does govern what you can and can't do. The reason the state got involved is reasonable. Is it's unfair to end a lease in the fall after the tenant has already done his fall plowing and got the fertilizer on for next year's crop. So in Illinois, there's a specific wording that you have to use, and you have to give that notice to the tenant at least 4 months prior to the expiration of that lease. Most of our leases expire February 28, February 29 in leap years. So that goes back to the end of October is the date that you have to give a written termination notice if you're going to terminate it. If you don't terminate it, it is automatically in effect for the next year.
It can be, I mean, a lot of leases do have a termination date in them. I know all of our leases do, like I said, last day of February. Technically, you may not have to give a written notification, but we prefer not to test the court system on that. So we still give written notification. So if your lease goes from January 1 to December 31st, remember 4 months before December 31st, you have to give written notification. The statutory lease year, and that was set up for the verbal leases, is March 1 through the last day of February.
We're going to change subjects again. Nathan, if you have any questions to build up in this time yet?
I guess so. Here's a question. If it's a handshake lease, do you still need notification in writing that you're going to terminate it?
Correct.
Yes.
And
Okay.
that falls under the statutory dates in Illinois of March 1 through the last day of February. So written notification has to be given by October 31st of the prior year. You know, so if the lease date is March 1, 2021, you have October 31st, 2020, you have to have provided written notification either in person or via certified return receipt mail by Illinois law of that lease termination.
Got it. Okay.
I'm looking at the clock. We've this hour has gone by pretty quickly. We're going to pick up here again. We've all been talking about, even with the lease, we're talking about risk management. Crop insurance is a big one. On behalf of the farmers, I want to thank you taxpayers for subsidizing the cost of our federal crop insurance. It works great. We can adapt our policy to suit our risk tolerance, our individual yield situation and location. I've got it would take a full week to educate you fully on all the nuances to what form of crop insurance you're going to take. But there's just lots of options available, even including catastrophic coverage, which is basically if you're 100% wiped out, a catastrophic policy is pretty cheap, but it just doesn't happen very often.
I think one of the things people need to realize is the non-farm folks is that these federal farm programs, whether it be the subsidies for the crop insurance or the other programs, it's food stabilization price more than anything, because hungry people have Well, we saw what happened in the last week when people get upset about things. So that's how one of the reasons the government can justify these costs is to, one, keep farmers in business so there's food produced, and two, that the price is stable for the price of food.
Okay.
So when the farmer has his crop insurance policy in place, he's comfortable selling crop ahead of time, because even if the market moves against him, that he's got insurance to cover up any deficit that he might have. The banker is going to be much more comfortable loaning money to someone who's covered with crop insurance. So he's reduced his risk. The landowner then can benefit because the farmer who has reduced risk is more comfortable paying a higher dollar amount of rent. And point out, this is a crop insurance program. Even though it's a federal program, it is separate from the USDA farm program, which we're going to talk about.
And farmers do have to pay for that part of that expense.
Yes. And as we've seen in the last couple of years, Congress loves to act by sending us additional money when we have a disaster. And getting into the farm programs is Rob's area of expertise.
Well, it used to be. I don't know what it is anymore. But when I worked for the Farm Service Agency in a previous life, I like to say, we were doing these set-aside acres where acres were set aside every year. I mean, and that went back to the Great Depression when the Dust Bowl days when prices plummeted because of overproduction. The programs were production control initially, set aside acres, land bank, whatever you want to call them. They had negative publicity over paying farmers not to farm land when people in third world countries, i.e. China at the time in the 60s and 70s, were starving. Heard that more than once from my mother. You know, there's some kid in China would love to have what you're not eating on that plate today. So, but they actually they were doomed to failure for us by doing this acreage reduction and current expansion overseas, because if there wasn't a supply of grain from the United States, it was grown elsewhere. And we're seeing that Brazil is cleaning our clock right now on soybean exports. And that has a lot to do with acres that have been brought in production down into the rainforest, but it also is a function of currency. The value of the Brazilian real versus the US dollar. The importing countries can buy so much more out of Brazil than they can in the United States, because grain is priced worldwide off the Chicago Board of Trade in US dollar increments. So in the 80s, we went to more what we call the freedom to farm prospect, where we didn't worry so much about the base acres and controlling production, where we went to more of a income support for the farmers. And part of that was due to the World Trade Organization and the ways that subsidies couldn't be based on per bushel basis. In the mid 1980s and 1985 Farm Bill, the Conservation Reserve Program was born, and so we've had this now for 40 years. It targeted ecologically fragile land.
Rob, we got out of sync here somehow. We got some lost some. Let's just wrap that up.
Okay.
Well, just go ahead and finish it. For some reason,
Conservation Reserve Program slide isn't there, but down the water, the Conservation Reserve Program is focused on water quality. 10 to 15-year contracts with the landowner, with the farm, to take lands out of production, and there's programs for wetlands, woodlands, and pastures. We use Conservation Reserve Program on farms I manage in McHenry County, where the Kishwaukee River is levels have become so high that land isn't necessarily farmable every year. So we use that to provide income for the landowner and reduce risk for the farm tenant by not having to farm those fragile areas. So that's one of the uses of this Conservation Reserve Program.
what I thought we would switch to is get away from the dry topic of economics and get more to the personal nature about what Rob and I do when the first time we get a new farm to manage, or we're looking at a farm, whether if a client wants to purchase it. And first thing I do is I want to see what I see, but I also want to look for what I don't see. I want to look at the topography of that farm, and that all relates to the water flow. Is it downhill from another farm? Do we have to deal with somebody else's erosion? If there's a crop there, I want to see what it looks like. If the soil tests are available, that's helpful. The yield history will do that as well. Although the yield history can be related to the talents of the individual tenant. You can have a farmer not do very well and have someone else farm it and raise the yields. I'm looking for drainage issues. The tile is endemic in central Illinois and most other Midwest states. So you don't know if it's there underground, but if it is there, it's got an outlet somewhere. So if there's a creek or a drainage ditch, I walk along those and look for those outlets. That tells me what's there. If I see an outlet, I can tell that landowner that he then has a depreciable drainage tile system in place. You got to look for boundary issues. If your boundary doesn't line up with the neighbor's boundary, you might want to find out why that is. It could be that the legal description is such that that's the way it's supposed to be, but it's very common for these boundaries to lose their original location over time. Erosion is an issue. The soil maps, you want to know the soil productivity. Aerial photography will tell you some things you can't see when you're on the ground. Access to the property can become an issue if it doesn't front up against a public road. You would generally have an easement to get to it. Power companies have easements for their power lines. Utilities may have easements for their underground pipelines. And I always like to look at the surrounding land use to see if there's something that might impact even though it's not on the farm that I'm looking at, it still could impact the landowner that I'm representing. When I'm meeting a farmer for the first time, the first thing I like to do is, if I have the opportunity, I tell him I'd like for us to meet in his machine shed, and I can learn more about that farmer, I think, than anything else, by looking around in that machine shed as to whether things are neat and orderly or if they're just scattered all over. And it's not because one is good and one is bad. It just tells you a little bit, or quite a bit actually, about the personality of that farmer. So I want to know who it is I'm dealing with. Is he kind of laid back, easygoing kind of guy, or does everything have to be in its place? And
OCD. we have tenants both ways. I'm not OCD in our farm shop, I can tell you that.
Yeah, if you look at my office and Rob's office, we have two different systems.
Yes.
Again, not one as good as one as bad, is just different. But I do look for some semblance of professionalism, some dedication to the profession, the attitude. Do they understand what we're trying to do, what the landowner wants? Do they understand their place in the system? Attention to detail, that phrase came out of my mouth on Tuesday when somebody asked the difference between farmers as to whether they do a better job or worse job than others. The flexibility issue, I've got a theory. I guess I can't prove it statistically, but farmers that farm large, level, rectangular pieces of ground seem to be much more rigid than people who have to farm ridge tops and river bottoms, farming around patches of trees and pond holes. Just seems like the guys who have to deal with a lot more varying conditions are more flexible in all other areas of their life as well. Before, I didn't worry too much about the labor supply of a farmer, but now I want to know who's his hired man. Does he have a dependable supply of labor, and does he have any skills in managing that labor? Most farmers are not trained in keeping people on the farm. Do they understand financing? Do they have a good relationship with their banker? Do they know what kind of money they're going to need, or are they going to be able to pay the rent? So that's a big issue. We do like to match the tenant to the landowner. I've got one landowner who's a little bit fussy, who farms his land. A lot of times he's thought that he liked the farmer, found out that he had a little personality conflict. I think I've had 4 different operators in the last 20 years on one farm. And nothing against the farmer, it's just the two didn't mesh for whatever reason. We're just personalities, we're not compatible. So I need to know the landowner goals and make sure that the farmer can understand those goals and be able to meet those. Communication skills are really important with the amount of land that Rob and I handle. We can't be on every farm as much as we would like to be. If there's an issue that comes up, we need to get a phone call. And it's wonderful now that people can take a picture with the same phone they call us on and let us know what they're saying. Attitude, decision-making skills. Sometimes the farmer wants to shove the decision off on us, but we're not there on the farm to see it. We don't really have the ability to make that decision, and we need to trust their judgment in a lot of cases. And one thing I've learned over the years, looking at the guy I picked to illustrate this slide, you don't want to judge the farmer by the coveralls or what hat he's wearing. That guy may have a master's in business administration. You don't know when you first meet him. So, just because they're wearing coveralls doesn't mean they're some hick farmer. That doesn't appear to be a hick farmer to me. Going back here, this is a speaker we heard at a conference in Arizona a few years back. His name's Chuck Backus. He is a rancher in Arizona. He is revolutionizing how ranchers there are pasturing their cattle in the Superstition Mountains and other areas. Turns out he turned to farming late in life. He actually has 2 degrees in nuclear engineering and did a lot of work for NASA over the years. Not what you think of as a typical rancher. This is what I thought I'd finish up with.
Hold up.
Okay.
Go back a picture, Kent. We have several young ladies now as farm tenants. We are willing to make those choices based on the person's skill, not their gender, because that young lady may be working with her dad, or may have worked with her dad, or maybe even started farming themselves. So they're few, but some of the female tenants that are there, they're really good. So I mean, I'm just pointing that out. It's not a man's world anymore when it comes to farming.
This is going to be our last slide, I believe, unless that conservation slide shows up here somehow. The FFA Creed. I was the Creed speaker in my chapter back when I was in high school. This creed was written in 1928, formally adopted by the Future Farmers of America in 1930. I can't remember the whole thing anymore, but I do remember that first phrase. I believe in the future of farming with a faith born not of words, but of deeds. And you should Google it sometime and read the whole thing. It will tell you a whole lot about the attitude that most farmers have towards their profession. So with that, I've got our email addresses up there. It'd be a good way to contact us. Phone number, if we're even not in the office, that will get forwarded to our cell phones. So you can, if you don't get your questions answered here now, you'll have the opportunity to contact us later.
All right. Well, Rob and Kent, thank you so much for this. There are some questions. I would encourage everyone to share your video now if you can, so we can see everyone. Please send me some more questions via the chat line. One of the questions I had was with farming being a super capital intensive enterprise, and with the price of commodities being what it is, what is, number one, what's the debt ratio? What kind of debt load do typical conventional farmers have? And what sort of mental psychology or state are they in with commodity prices and all that debt load?
It's a age function. Young farmers come in generally, unless they've inherited quite a bundle, they're heavily in debt to purchase their machinery, and they have to have operating money every year to pay for their inputs. In terms of dollar amount, it's not unusual for somebody to have $250,000, $500,000 in operating money.
Up to $1 million, any kind of size. You'll see the younger farmers with maybe up to 60% debt to asset ratio. And we have some that are worse than that. As they get more established, or may own land or inherited some land or whatever, a lot of times they'll push down in the low 20%. But it's still, Nathan, it's still about a cash flow issue too. I mean, they may have plenty of equity, but be cash poor. Just,
Yeah.
you know, and not be able to cash flow a situation because of grain sales or poor production or whatever. Right now, the farmer's attitude is very cautious, and some of them aren't very good, especially on a higher cash rent farm when you see the negative margins. But each farmer handles it different.
Okay. Also, can you give me an idea of what the CRP Conservation Reserve Program is that through NRCS, and then what sort of revenue flow does that provide to the farmland owner?
Conservation Reserve Program is administered through the Farm Service Agency.
Okay.
The CSP, Conservation Security Program, I'm not certain if it even exists anymore. We've not used that a lot. That is administered by NRCS as well as the EQIP program. CRP rental rates are based on the quality of the land. And I'm going to tell a little story here. That originated with my FSA office here in Springfield, Illinois. We had a large entity. It was actually the city of Springfield at the time. They had just flat rental rates by county, and they had what they called the Lake 2 project. The lake's still not been built, but they had a lot of poor quality land that they had bought and were going to put it in the CRP program. And they wanted to put it all in $80 an acre, and they bid it in at that. And the county committee, who has the ultimate decision on whether something is acceptable, said, no, that's more than what that land would rent for. And we turned down a lot of those contracts. And then we built the concept of, based on the productivity of the soil, what the rental rates would be, is why a lot of how the CRP program evolved into what it's doing now, paying rent based on the quality of the land.
The rate that's paid has to compete with the cash rent or the value of the land somehow, or farmers would never buy into it.
Okay, got it. And again, that's paid to the landowner, correct? CRP?
Generally, yes. I mean, if a landowner may not be eligible for a payment, and I'm going to use the McHenry County Conservation District, I don't believe would be eligible to receive a CRP payment. Ed's going to tell me if I'm wrong there. But at the same time, they could have a lease with the tenant, and the tenant gets the payment and then turns around and pays a cash rent payment to the district equal to or maybe a little bit less. It's one way of working the system. I'll just say it, for lack of a better word.
All right, and then we have a question beyond the legal deadline, sort of back to the topic of lease cancellation, beyond the legal deadline under Illinois statutory law, what is a respectful notice date so that the tenant would have adequate time to find alternative land? So there's the law, and then there's sort of courtesy.
Giving a notice is a tricky thing to handle. I got into this profession thinking it would be the worst thing I would ever have to do in my career. Found out it's the second worst thing. It's a serious issue. People take it as being fired, and it's what it is. It's a humiliating. It's a rejection. It's a slap in the face. There are people who will lose their temper, and you have to be very cognizant. I know one of my coworkers is in a different employer situation. He wanted some backup, 2 people, when he was going to meet with this tenant because he wasn't sure how he was going to react.
Wow.
And that's not unusual. It's a very emotional thing to do. That's why we do try to do it in person. If you try to send a letter or do it by email or text, that's chickening out. You do want to be face to face to man up and to deal with the emotions that are going to come bubbling up.
Okay.
So if it's something that's obvious, the tenant may know it's coming. Yeah, you just give them notice well ahead of time. If you know he's not going to react well, you don't want to give him too much time because he could do some damage to the farm in the meantime.
Oh.
September 1st to the end of October is typically the time that it's done. You can give notice too early by Illinois statute also. I don't remember what that time frame is.
It can't be more than 6 months prior to the expiration.
Right. So that's a September 1st through the end of October, based on Illinois statutory dates. And we understand that, that if a landowner, if we're not involved and a landowner lives in Pennsylvania or whatever, certified mail's how they're going to do it, or they're going to have their lawyer have it given, hand delivered. There's many ways of doing it legally, but I like to do it in person. Sometimes I can't give a better answer than the landowner wants to make a change. I'll give you an example of a farm that one of our organic farms here in the county. The current tenant said, or not, the previous tenant said, yes, he would do that. But it wasn't progressing the way the landowner wanted. And we had to make a termination of a tenant, that was second generation tenant on the farm. And, they didn't like it, but they finally said, well, it is her farm. And if that's what she wants, that's the way it is. Within 3 years, that same farmer was farming organically some ground he owns himself. So a positive came out of the negative. So
the other thing to keep in mind is if you're on a 50-50 crop share, for example, and you serve the termination notice before the crop is harvested, definite possibility that his half of the crop could end up being a little bit bigger than your half of the crop. So
vast majority of the farmers are honest and won't do that, but there are some that would take revenge. Okay.
Got it. There's also a question. This is an interesting one. I'm not exactly sure. It says, what is a reasonable amount of acreage or farms for an individual property manager to try and manage in a year?
The amount that we have is unreasonable, but
No, it's not.
when we tell people how much land we are managing, their jaws generally drop. But you have to understand our two largest clients are probably 80% of our acreage. So if we had to divvy all those up into smaller owners, it would be unbearable. We would not be able to keep up with the workload.
And a lot of it's cash rent also. I mean, it depends on the lease type.
Okay.
Obviously, if we were doing 60,000 acres of crop share lease, no way could we do it, the two of us do it. A large percentage of that is cash rent, so it doesn't take as much of our time as a crop share lease because we're not so involved with minutia.
I think probably 10 or 15,000 acres would be a good ballpark estimate of what a professional farm manager would take care of
on a crop share basis. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And that would be full time for them.
We have another question from the last presentation, just talking about managing soil and everything else. Do you have any recommended soil health indicators that you or your landowner, your client, can sort of use to sort of tell whether the farm's soil is getting better or worse in terms of its kind of more biological life?
Well, I mean, just a typical soil tests are going to tell us where especially in a cash rent situation, where the farm's being maintained fertility-wise. The Haney test is new enough at this point in time that, there's no historical data for those. It would be that a farmer or a landowner would just have to start having a Haney test done every couple of years on the farm. So that's the best indicator right now. Your crops are going to tell you somewhat the soil health, the erosion that's on the farm, the weed pressure that's there. There are visual indicators that can't necessarily be quantified physically.
I always have either a spade or a trowel with me, and because most of our landowners are not local, they're off in another state, but I can send them pictures. If you have a spade full of dirt and it's just a lot of earthworms come out of that shovel full of dirt, that's a good indicator.
Your chocolate cake look like,
Or you dig a hole in the ground and you stick your pocket knife in the side and you'd almost break it off if you try to pull it out. That's an indicator that soil's not real healthy. It's a little too compacted.
Yeah, like I said, a lot of visual stuff, not necessarily quantifiable stuff.
Got it. And then if you had to give like top 5 tips for a landowner to apply when asking their tenant to use cover crops or try to modify practices for better soil health, what would those tips be?
In terms of changing the tenants or
Practice.
making him more accepting, well, for cover crop example I can use, I got a farm now that we've had cover crops on for, I think, 6 years. And I can produce a graph of our yields go up every year. And it's the poorest soils of any farm that I manage out of the 110 that I take care of. And so the yields are nothing that, you're not going to look at those numbers and say, wow, that's a high yield. But you have to realize that the university would say those soils are only capable of producing 160 bushel corn, and we're getting 210.
Wow.
So to me, that just, it's anecdotal, but it's effective.
Yep.
The other thing that, one of the other things that I would say is if those are practices that you want, be willing to give a carrot out there, either reduce rent, paying part of the seed cost, accept part of the risk for get the farmer to do it. And if after several years it becomes palatable or they're seeing the benefit of it, then maybe you can back that off. So. And
then you could also just say, well, we're just going to try this on this field, and it's not one that's visible from the road, so you won't have to be embarrassed with your neighbors. We'll just try it on this field and see if it works.
I see. Let's see. Actually, here's a question regarding transitioning to organic. How does transitioning to organic affect yields in your experience?
Well, my goal is that it doesn't affect it much at all. It's going to depend on the quality of the farm. Every year is different. We get years like 2019 with lots of rain. We did take some hits on the transition farms. The quality of the farm has a lot to do with any yield hits that you take. Having a good plan in place, not just going into it without a plan A through C or D. That's the thing with conventional. If you have a weed issue, you call up whoever's going to spray it and they spray it. In organic, obviously you can't do that. If you got a weed issue, you got to know how to take care of that weed issue, or you're going to have that year that you, like Kent mentioned on Tuesday, you don't harvest the field because of weed pressure. So it's higher risk. So the goal is not to have any yield loss or very minimal yield loss, but it is more likely to happen.
With corn, especially, it's difficult under an organic system to get enough nitrogen on, especially if you don't have a source of animal manure.
Right.
To get an approved nitrogen source is extremely expensive.
Okay. Here's, I guess, another question. You said, well, 2 things just about the farm management business. Number 1, what do you charge? How does that work? And then number 2, you said that letting a tenant go, you thought was going to be the worst thing. What is the worst thing?
But what was the first question?
What's your,
we work on a commission. There's a number of arrangements. It's like most things in life, it's negotiable. We have to look at what's the size of the operation, how much time is it going to take, how much time does it take to get there, what's the lease arrangement going to be, what's expected of us. So the fee percentage is generally be like a real estate commission. It's going to vary by the property, but it's going to be a single-digit percentage of the gross income.
So generally, it's off the gross income. I do have some net income fees. I have fees that are a percent of revenue with a flat with a cap on it. As Kent says, it's negotiable. It's just based on the operation.
Got it.
Going to the absolute worst thing that we have to do is not terminating the guy. It's hiring the guy that comes after him. Because you give the guy the termination notice, he blows up, he calls you names, he uses a lot of potty words, and you let him blow off the steam, and then you don't feel good, and he doesn't feel good, but that gets done with. Then you got the process of interviewing another 10 or 15 or 20 farmers. One guy out of that batch is going to love you. You're going to be his best buddy. The other 18 or 19 are going to feel just like the guy that you terminated. You say, why didn't I get it?
And also hiring a new tenant then becomes, if you didn't hire the previous guy, your recommendation to the landowner, then if you made a bad selection and the landowner goes with it, you might fall on the sword too. So it is one of the most serious thing we do as far as making the right selection.
Excellent.
And sometimes we don't.
So any concluding words of advice for private or public farmland owners in terms of, as they think about the time they devote to managing their farmland, to the practices, just that whole set of things?
Well, in terms of what we do, I guess our philosophy has always been do what's right for the landowner. And that's been our key to success. I think in terms of the landowner themselves, do what's right for the land, and everything else will follow.
Rob, any final words?
I can't cover it pretty well.
Okay. Well, thank you. I'm going to bring this to a close. Rob and Kent, really, really appreciate you pitching in and putting a lot of mind work into how to present all this information in a concise, sort of understandable way. I really appreciate working with both of you, and especially appreciate the fact that you're willing to take questions and calls from our registrants and sort of just give them feedback on any questions they might have. That is super, super nice. Everyone who's watching, I really appreciate you joining this session and being interested in this topic. Just glad that you take land ownership really seriously and are trying to contribute to a better ag system. We are going to have a webinar series coming up later in June and into July. It's going to be about insects in agriculture. There's going to be 6 sessions. The first 2 sessions will be on June 16th and June 18th. They'll feature Jonathan Lundgren from the Ecdysis Foundation. He's going to have some really interesting things to say. I'll be sending out an email to everyone on this list with more information about that. And I'm also going to be sending a poll or a survey to everyone, just asking for your feedback on how helpful this was. I'd really appreciate you filling out. Again, everyone, Rob and Kent especially, thank you very much. Thanks for your thoughtfulness around farming, and have a great day.